You know, most people would have laughed it off, David Collins said, his smirk widening as he glanced around the lavish dinner table. But I wonder if you can even understand what I'm talking about. The words hung in the air like a challenge, sharp enough to cut through the soft jazz music playing in the background and the faint clinking of crystal glasses. The room, filled with the elite of Silicon Valley, fell into a tense, expectant silence. David Collins, CEO of one of the world's most powerful tech companies, leaned back in his chair, watching the woman before him. Jasmine Parker, a young black waitress with almond-shaped eyes and a calm demeanor, stood quietly by his side, her tray perfectly balanced in one hand. Her uniform, though crisp, hardly stood out in a room where billionaires discussed mergers and future technologies. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. In fact, she was invisible to most of the room, a ghost in the background, simply there to serve. David's words were meant as a joke, something to amuse the men at the table. But Jasmine's response was about to flip the script. "You're right," she said softly, her voice steady, betraying no hint of fear or discomfort. "I may not know much about your numbers, but I do know this. The real power in this room isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the choices you make when no one's watching." David blinked, momentarily taken aback. He hadn't expected her to respond. In fact, he hadn't expected her to even understand the question. But there she was, standing in front of him, composed, calm, and somehow challenging him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The table fell into a stunned silence. The men, who had been laughing just moments ago, exchanged glances. David's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "What?" he asked, his voice tight, unsure of how to react. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She simply held his gaze. "You asked if I knew what you were talking about," she continued. "And I do. You were talking about wealth, about power. But the truth is, real power isn't something you can measure with money. It's something you earn by how you treat people when they have nothing to offer you." There was a shift in the room. For the first time that evening, the conversation stopped revolving around business deals, stock prices, and the latest tech trends. Instead, all eyes were on Jasmine, a woman who had been written off by everyone in the room just moments earlier. Her words had pierced through the arrogance that had been thick in the air. David, once the center of attention, now found himself staring at the young waitress in stunned silence. Jasmine, who had been dismissed as just another employee, had just made him question everything he thought he knew about power. Her calm words had shattered the illusion of control he'd carefully cultivated for years. It wasn't just her response that had stunned him, it was the fact that she had seen him, not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man who hid behind his wealth and his influence. And for the first time in his life, David Collins wasn't sure if he had the upper hand. Jasmine didn't speak again. She simply turned and walked away, her tray steady in her hands, leaving behind a room full of powerful men who had just been confronted with their own arrogance. The silence that followed her departure was heavier than any conversation they had been having moments before. They all knew it, though no one dared to speak it out loud. Jasmine Parker, the woman they had all dismissed, had just turned the tables on the most powerful man in the room, and she hadn't said a word too many. The dinner table was still silent, as if the words Jasmine had spoken had frozen the very air. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been caught off guard, something that rarely happened to him. He was used to controlling conversations, to commanding attention with just a word or a gesture. But now, for the first time in years, he felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the power he had worked so hard to build was slipping away. The room, once buzzing with laughter and light-hearted chatter, now hummed with an uncomfortable tension. The eyes of the other guests shifted uneasily between Jasmine and David, unsure of how to proceed. But Jasmine remained unfazed. She moved gracefully around the table, serving the remaining courses, her steps light and measured. She didn't rush. She didn't look at anyone. She just did her job, and in doing so, she commanded more attention than any of them had expected. David, still stunned by her response, couldn't take his eyes off her. How had she done it? How had she reduced him to a mere spectator in a conversation he thought he had full control over? For the first time in his life, David wondered if he had underestimated her. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to judge their worth based on what they could do for him. But Jasmine, she was different. She didn't play by the same rules. Jasmine wasn't looking for approval, wasn't trying to impress anyone. And that, David realized, was what made her dangerous. He looked around the table, his eyes narrowing as he saw the expressions on the faces of the other men. They were watching him, waiting for him to say something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But David couldn't find the words. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick. Jasmine moved from one end of the table to the other, refilling glasses and serving food with the precision of a surgeon. Her hands were steady, her movements fluid, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. But it wasn't the way she moved that caught everyone's attention. It was the way she held herself. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, a sense of purpose that no one had expected from someone in her position. And it was that confidence that made David uneasy. He had built his empire by knowing exactly how to manipulate the people around him, how to bend them to his will. But Jasmine, she wasn't like the others. She didn't need his approval, didn't care for his praise. In fact, she didn't seem to care about anything except doing her job. And yet, she had managed to shatter the illusion of power he had so carefully crafted. David's thoughts were interrupted when one of his colleagues, Trent, leaned in and whispered something in his ear. "You going to let her talk to you like that?" Trent asked, a smirk playing on his lips. A waitress, no less. That was bold, man. David looked at Trent, his jaw tightening. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone like Trent. But he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Jasmine as she moved around the table, her face calm and composed. She seemed completely unaffected by the tension in the room, as if she had already won. And in a way, she had. Jasmine wasn't just a waitress anymore. She had become the center of attention without ever trying. David's mind raced as he thought about what had just happened. She had turned the tables on him with a single sentence. And now, as he sat there, unable to speak, unable to regain his footing, he realized something important. Jasmine had done something that no one, not even he, had expected. She had taken his power, his control, and she had made it hers. It was a humbling moment. And for the first time in a long while, David wasn't sure if he knew how to handle it. David sat at the table, trying to refocus on the conversation at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to Jasmine. The words she had spoken earlier echoed in his mind, each one landing with the force of a truth he wasn't prepared to hear. Real power isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the choices you make when no one's watching. Those words lingered in the air like an unfinished symphony, and he couldn't seem to shake them. The room around him, once filled with the sounds of laughter and negotiations, now felt distant and hollow. Jasmine had done something that even he, a master of manipulation and control, couldn't quite understand. She had turned the tables on him without ever raising her voice, without ever breaking a sweat. She had exposed him, not in front of the public or his competitors, but in front of himself. He wasn't sure if he felt anger or awe, maybe both. David had spent his life being the one who commanded attention, the one who set the rules and controlled the narrative. But now, sitting there in the midst of the world he had built, he felt small. The men at the table seemed oblivious to the shift in energy, continuing to discuss business deals and acquisitions, unaware of the tension that had gripped their leader. But David couldn't focus on the numbers, the bottom line, or the future of his empire. All he could think about was the woman who had made him question everything he knew about power. As Jasmine moved through the room, refilling glasses and serving food, she carried herself with an undeniable grace, one that didn't scream for attention but commanded it nonetheless. David watched her, captivated by the way she moved, the way she seemed to be in control without even trying. It was a stark contrast to the world he had come to know, a world where power was a game of domination, manipulation, and influence. Jasmine, however, played a different game, a game where strength came from within, from something deeper than status or wealth. As she approached the table again, David's heart rate quickened. He didn't know what he expected from her this time. Perhaps an apology, a moment of vulnerability, or maybe even a second shot at putting her in her place. But Jasmine didn't offer any of those things. Instead, she simply placed a new bottle of wine in front of him and smiled. A smile that was neither warm nor cold, just knowing. It was as if she could see right through him, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The silence between them stretched out, and for a moment, It felt like the entire room had disappeared. No one else existed but the two of them, caught in a quiet dance of unspoken understanding. Finally, David broke the silence. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice almost hesitant, unsure of where this conversation was heading. Jasmine didn't look at him as she adjusted the wine glasses. "And what did you expect?" she asked, her voice still calm, still unwavering. David leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I thought you'd be, like the others. Desperate. Out to impress me." Jasmine paused for a fraction of a second before continuing with her task, her movements fluid, almost rhythmic. "I'm not interested in impressing you," she said simply. Else seemed to break something inside him. David had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him: money, power, validation. But Jasmine wasn't looking for any of that. She didn't need anything from him. In that moment, David realized that she held the power, not him. She was in control, not because she sought it, but because she didn't care to play by his rules. He swallowed hard, feeling a pang of something unfamiliar. Respect, maybe? Or was it humility? He wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the one who had the upper hand. Jasmine finished her task and walked away, her footsteps light but purposeful. David watched her go, his mind still spinning, trying to process what had just happened. He had never been in a position like this before, and it left him feeling exposed in a way he couldn't quite explain. For the first time in years, David felt like the one who had been played. And as much as it frustrated him, a part of him couldn't help but admire her for it. Jasmine didn't need to say anything more. She had already said it all, with a simple glance and a few well-chosen words. And in doing so, she had turned the tables on a billionaire CEO who thought he was untouchable. David sat there, his mind still grappling with the quiet shift in the room, trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. Jasmine's words had been like a mirror, reflecting back at him all the things he had spent years building and protecting. He had always thought of himself as the one in control, the one who set the rules, the one who could manipulate situations to his advantage. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he had felt powerless. He could still hear her voice in his head, calm and unshaken, each word cutting through the air with surgical precision. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to get anything from him. She had simply spoken the truth, and in doing so, she had flipped the entire power dynamic. As he sat there, David felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. For years, he had built his empire on the assumption that money and influence could control everything. But Jasmine, she had no need for any of that. She had stood there, unaffected by his wealth or status, and had made him question everything. The power he had relied on for so long suddenly felt fragile, like a house of cards ready to collapse. He wasn't sure if he should be angry or impressed. Maybe both. But what troubled him the most was the fact that he couldn't stop thinking about her. She wasn't just another employee. She wasn't just someone he could dismiss or ignore. She had become something else entirely, a symbol of something he couldn't quite define. He tried to refocus, to bring himself back to the conversation at hand, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Jasmine. How had she done it? How had she so effortlessly exposed his vulnerability, made him question his own authority? It was maddening. His mind was still too tangled, still too focused on Jasmine. He nodded slowly, trying to push the feelings aside. Other men at the table. But somehow, she had made herself the center of attention. It was the kind of power that couldn't be bought or manipulated, the kind of power that David realized he had never truly understood until now. He glanced over at her again. She was moving gracefully between tables, her movements fluid and effortless. She didn't seem to notice the stares or the whispers. She simply did her job. And in doing so, she had left him, a billionaire CEO, wondering if his wealth and status had ever truly given him any real power at all. Jasmine was different. That much was certain. As he watched her, David felt a strange sense of admiration building inside him, a respect he couldn't quite explain. She wasn't intimidated by the men in the room, not even him. She was self-assured, quiet, and composed. It was as if she carried an inner strength that no one could touch, a strength that came from within and not from the power that money or titles could bring. Now, as he watched her work, as he thought about the quiet power she had displayed, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been playing the wrong game all along. The night went on, But David's thoughts didn't stray far from Jasmine. She had somehow shifted the power dynamic in a way he couldn't have predicted, and he found himself oddly fascinated by her presence. It wasn't just her beauty or her calm demeanor. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, the way she wasn't fazed by the world around her. Or maybe it was the way she had spoken so boldly, so unapologetically, without even trying to impress anyone. Dinner felt different. His usual routine, the back-to-back meetings, the constant flow of emails, the never-ending rush of business. None of it seemed as important as it once had. Bustling atmosphere hit him just as it had the first time. The sound of silverware clinking, the quiet murmur of conversation, the smell of freshly prepared meals, it was all the same. But this time, something felt different. His eyes scanned the room, searching for her, and there she was, moving between the tables with that same quiet grace, her posture straight, her movements fluid. She didn't see him at first, and for a moment, he just watched her, taking in the way she interacted with the guests, the way she never seemed to rush or flinch. She was in control, in a way that he had never understood until now. As she passed by his table, she glanced at him, but there was no recognition in her eyes, no change in her demeanor. She simply did her job, as she always had. But for David, it was like the whole room had come to a standstill. "Jasmine," he called softly, his voice catching her attention. She stopped, but didn't immediately turn to face him. Instead, she paused, as if she were considering whether or not to acknowledge him. After a moment, she did. "Mr. Collins," she said evenly, her voice calm. "Can I get you something?" There was no warmth in her tone, no bitterness either, just a simple question. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. He had never been in a position like this before, where he was the one left to figure out what came next. "I just wanted to apologize," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to soften just slightly. "For what?" she asked, her tone still neutral. "For the way I treated you," David said, his words feeling heavier than he had expected. "For the way I dismissed you." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Jasmine said nothing. Then, finally, she nodded. "It's okay," she said simply. "I didn't take it personally." David felt a weight lift off his chest, though he wasn't sure why. He had expected to feel embarrassed, to feel defensive, but instead, there was a strange sense of relief. The apology wasn't about making things right in the traditional sense. It was about acknowledging that he had learned something from her. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "And I want to thank you." Jasmine gave him a small smile, one that didn't reveal much, but enough to show that she understood. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "You just had to listen." And with that, she turned to walk away, leaving David to sit at the table, the weight of her words settling in. He realized, in that moment, that his journey had only just begun. He had thought he was in control, but now, he understood that there was so much more to learn, and it wasn't something that could be bought or manipulated. It was something that had to be earned from within. David left the restaurant that evening feeling something he hadn't felt in years: clarity. It wasn't the kind of clarity that came from making another successful deal or conquering a new market. It was deeper, more unsettling. He had spent his whole life believing that power came from influence, wealth, and status, but now, in the quiet after the storm, he realized how little those things really mattered. As he walked through the bustling streets of the city, his thoughts kept returning to Jasmine. She had somehow managed to shatter everything he had built, not through force or confrontation, but by simply existing. She had given him a glimpse of a power that didn't need validation from anyone. It wasn't the power that came from a boardroom or a bank account. It was something else entirely, something real. He walked slowly, the sounds of the city fading into the background as his mind raced. He had spent so long building his empire, thinking that success was all about domination, about being the one in control. But now he wasn't so sure. Jasmine had shown him a different way of living, one that didn't rely on controlling everything around you. She had lived her life with quiet strength, and in doing so, she had captured his attention in a way no one ever had. David had always been used to being the one who held all the cards, but Jasmine had no need for cards. She had something more valuable, something he couldn't buy. As he sat in his car, staring out at the city skyline, David knew that something had changed in him. He wasn't sure exactly what it was, but he felt it deep within himself. It was as if he had been blind to something important his entire life, and now, for the first time, he was beginning to see clearly. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him of a meeting in the morning. He glanced at the message but didn't respond right away. The meeting could wait. He didn't need to rush back to his office. For once, he felt like he had all the time in the world to figure things out. He didn't want to go back to his old ways, climbing the corporate ladder, chasing deals, winning at any cost. That life had left him empty, and he knew it. He needed something more. But what? He thought about Jasmine, about her quiet dignity and the way she had stood up to him without ever raising her voice. It was a level of self-assurance he didn't fully understand, but he knew one thing. It was something he wanted to learn. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to start somewhere. The next morning, he called his assistant and canceled the meeting. He needed a day to himself, to reflect and find a new direction. He wasn't sure what that would look like, but he was willing to figure it out. David spent the day walking around the city, taking in the sights and sounds, letting his thoughts drift. He found himself at a small park, sitting on a bench and watching people walk by. It was a simple moment, but it felt profound. He had spent so much of his life focused on the big picture, on the next big deal, on how to get ahead. But now, in this quiet park, he realized that maybe the small moments, the ones that didn't seem important, were where true meaning could be found. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, David felt something shift inside him. He didn't need to be the most powerful person in the room anymore. He didn't need to control everything. What he needed was to learn how to live authentically, how to connect with people in a real way, without the masks and the games. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with that realization. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was on the right path. As he walked back to his car, he made a decision. He was going to reach out to Jasmine, not for business, not to try and manipulate her into giving him some kind of advantage, but because he wanted to learn from her. He wanted to understand how she had achieved a kind of strength he had never known. He wasn't sure how she would respond, but he knew it was a step in the right direction. It was time for a new chapter in his life. He didn't need to be the one in control anymore. He just needed to be himself. David walked into the cafe, the soft hum of conversation and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. It wasn't a high-end restaurant, but it felt right for what he had planned. He had spent the last few days thinking about how he wanted to approach this meeting with Jasmine, unsure of what exactly he was looking for, but knowing that he needed to make this step. His life had been about power, influence, and control, but all of that had begun to feel empty. Now, as he sat down at the table, waiting for her, he felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He wasn't sure if she would even agree to meet with him, but there was no turning back now. His phone buzzed, and he glanced down to see her name on the screen. "I'm here," the message read. David looked up to see her enter the cafe, her presence calm and composed as always. She didn't look for recognition. She didn't need the spotlight. She simply walked to the table, her steps measured and steady. She was exactly as he remembered her, unbothered, unshaken. "Hi, Mr. Collins," she said, offering him a polite but neutral smile. "Jasmine," David greeted, standing up to shake her hand. There was an awkward moment as they sat down, both unsure of how to start. Jasmine had no reason to be here, and David wasn't sure what he was hoping to gain. But he knew this conversation was necessary. He had to understand something about her, about the strength she carried, something he couldn't find in the world he had built. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me," he began, his voice steady but with an underlying note of uncertainty. Jasmine simply nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about our last meeting. You said something that's been on my mind ever since." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "You said that real power isn't measured by your bank account, and I've spent my life thinking that power was about control, about having the most money, the best connections. But you showed me that it's not about any of that. It's about something else, something real." There was a long pause. David wasn't sure if Jasmine would even acknowledge what he was saying, but he needed to get it out. "I want to understand. How did you learn that? How did you learn to be you? To not need anything from anyone?" Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her eyes focused on him as she processed his words. She didn't rush to answer. Her gaze was calm, almost studying him, as if weighing his sincerity. After a moment, she spoke. It wasn't something I learned from anyone else. It's something that comes from within. You can't find that kind of power by looking outside yourself. It's not about what people see in you or how they treat you. It's about knowing who you are, what you stand for, and not compromising on that. David listened intently, his mind racing. The simplicity of her words cut through him in a way nothing else had before. It wasn't about manipulation. It wasn't about influence. It was about integrity, about being true to yourself, regardless of the noise around you. Jasmine continued, I wasn't always like this. I've been through a lot in my life. I've had to fight for what I have, just like everyone else. But somewhere along the way, I realized that no matter how much I tried to please others or fit into their expectations, I would always feel empty if I wasn't being true to myself. David sat back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long chasing after external validation, chasing after deals, after power, after influence, that he had forgotten what it meant to simply be. To be honest with himself. To live without pretending. I think I've spent my whole life running from that, he said softly. I've always felt like I needed to be the one in control, the one who had all the answers, the one who could make everyone listen. But now, I don't know if that's enough anymore. Jasmine's eyes softened. It's not. And that's okay. You're allowed to not have all the answers. You're allowed to not always be the one in control. It doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human. David nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe. He didn't have to carry the world on his shoulders. He didn't have to be perfect. He just had to be himself. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. Jasmine smiled, the faintest hint of warmth in her expression. You're welcome, she replied. As they sat there, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, David realized something important. He didn't need to be the most powerful person in the room anymore. He didn't need to control everything. What he needed was to live authentically, to embrace the vulnerability that came with being true to himself. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most powerful thing he could do.